Thank you, Father. And thank you to all of you for being at this conference and for the really stimulating conversation so far. So I want to make an ironic set of claims today, I think, but also critical claims about both Thomism and phenomenology. So I want to claim that, as others have noted, that Thomism and phenomenology can and should aid one another. And in particular, I want to claim that they should aid us in reaching the end of the intellectual life, which I think is contemplation of what is fundamental to reality. That's what we're trying to do here. Nevertheless, I want to argue that these schools of thought require supplementation by other schools of thought, by other methods, because whether taken on their own or taken together, I think Thomism and phenomenology are inadequate for reaching the end contemplation of what is fundamental to reality. And to support these claims, I want to consider some ways in which any two schools of thought can try to aid each other, and I'm going to use a causal analysis, something like what Father Philip Neri did yesterday, though I'll only consider 3 of the 4 causes. I'm going to conflate 2 of them. And ultimately, I want to argue that we can see how Thomism and phenomenology can best aid one another inasmuch as each of them provides something necessary for achieving the end of human intellectual life, which the other does not provide. And then I'll close by arguing that Thomism and phenomenology help us attain contemplation best when they're synthesized together with what I have elsewhere described as the aesthetic method, which I think allows us to synthesize and transcend Thomism and phenomenology. A first way that two schools can try to dialogue, I think, is materially. And by that, I mean they can dialogue in terms of their content, their principles, their claims, and the thinkers and traditions on which they draw. So in Father Philip Neri's terms yesterday, this is both a material causal and an efficient causal account of traditions. So many Thomists, for example, John of St. Thomas, famously described Thomisms materially as those who defend and harmonize the philosophical and theological claims of St. Thomas and his followers. That's a summary. John of St. Thomas gives 5 conditions for being a Thomist, but they amount to that. Jean-Luc Marion presents phenomenologists materially as those who extend the breakthroughs to pure objectivity or to being made by Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and their followers, including himself. Considered materially, dialogue between schools involves translating ideas from one school to the other and then attempting to harmonize them. If we're engaged in dialogue on this basis, we'll consider whether the conclusions reached by one school were reached by the other, but maybe stated in different words. Or we'll try to figure out whether one school reaches conclusions that were not reached by the other, but are harmonizable with it. Or whether the other school reaches conclusions that are in irreconcilable conflict with one's own school. And I think we see this approach to dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology exemplified by the work of Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II. Phenomenology, he notes, directs our attention to phenomena like lived experience had from the subjective first-person point of view. Since it is subjective, lived experience can't be grasped merely as an aspect of third-person, objectively describable Thomistic categories like action, passion, quality, or substance. Rather, Wojtyła thinks, Thomistic metaphysics must be supplemented with phenomenological conclusions by positing a new category of being, lived experience, which contains accidents that are only graspable from a first-person point of view. Since Thomism is oriented towards attending to all features of reality, it's open, Wojtyła thinks, to being supplemented with phenomenological content. So what he's done here is he's taken some phenomenological findings and he's translated them into the language of Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, recasting the phenomena described by phenomenology as beings of a new kind. And he thinks that this joining of the content of the two schools leads us to a more complete, more unified account of reality than just straight Thomism on its own. Now, when one is engaged in materially based dialogue, one starts with the principles of one's own school, as Wojtyła does with Thomism, and considers the other school on that basis. Thomists will approach phenomenological claims using principles like the law of non-contradiction, laws of causality, accounts of the transcendentals and the categories, and the view that we only arrive at proper knowledge to the extent that we grasp the being of things, principle that Walter cited earlier. But these basic principles are questioned by many phenomenologists. For example, Jean-Luc Marion denies that we can receive the given as such in every case. It is the very appearing of a phenomenon, like the beauty of an artwork or of a beloved face, if we subsume it under principles like these. Receiving what is given requires setting out of attention what is not directly given, like the content of abstract concepts and the principles of logic and metaphysics. I cannot let the whole glorious appearance of a face or an artwork give itself to me if I were thinking about it as captured in delimited concepts, or just in terms of its relations to its causes. To only consider what appears insofar as it falls under concepts and principles is to fail to consider the given in itself, which is the source of all knowledge. If some claim cannot be grounded in what is given, it cannot be known to be true. In effect, this is not how Marion would put it, and Emmanuel is going to object strongly to what I'm going to say. Marion's contention, understood in Thomistic terms, is that the claims of Thomism preclude realism. I think we could, understood in a certain sense, Marion could cast himself as more of a realist than the Thomists. I cannot perceive the things themselves, the given itself, if I never attend to things themselves. But if I always only think about other things like their causes, or if I always subordinate the given to aspects of myself, like my concepts or my principles. Whatever a concept or principle enables us to grasp, there is always more to the given than the content they capture. Whatever content there is in a concept or principle, it is derived from and less than the full content of the given. A beautiful face is a given phenomenon in its own right, a phenomenon that meaningfully fits with me, but also exceeds its fit with me. It is never only what corresponds to my ideas of a being, an effect, or a thing to be explained. But despite this critique of the Thomistic use of principles, phenomenologists nevertheless submit phenomena to their own set of principles. Again, drawing on Marion, these include principles like, all that is offered originally to us in intuition must be simply received as that which is given, or as much reduction, as much givenness. That is, we perceive what is given and fundamental in a phenomenon only to the extent that it is subjected to phenomenological method. Just as phenomenologists have reason to reject basic Thomistic principles and concepts, or at least to contend that they do not capture what is fundamental, so likewise, Thomists have reason to reject the fundamentality of phenomenological principles. Thomists will contend that the very experience of the given, which they'll contend includes experiences of being and causality, reveals to us that there is more to reality than what is given. Concepts like being and causal principles guide us to grasp more of reality than the given. We cannot arrive at what is fundamental, the Thomist will contend, if we limit ourselves to just what is offered in intuition, to what directly appears, or to what is first in the order of knowing. I don't fully see the beauty of a beloved face if I just attend to its given appearance. Rather, I really see its beauty more deeply and fully when I see it as the beauty of a being, a person, who has depths that do not appear, and who includes relations that can only be known by reasoning, but are not fully directly given, like relations of being caused by God and participating in God. If one school approaches another guided only by its own content and principles, it will have to reject the other school whenever it seems to have distinct, incompatible, fundamental principles. Neither Thomism nor phenomenology, considered just in terms of its content, has the resources to explain or accommodate all the claims of the other, since the principles of each do not seem to apply to what is fundamental according to the other. But I think that from the standpoint of holistic experience, there's reason to hold on to both schools' principles. When I think about anything, I always, at least implicitly, automatically arrive at concepts of the transcendental properties of being: unity, truth, goodness. I always see things as unified, true, good. And I automatically, at least implicitly, arrive at Thomistic theoretical principles, like the law of non-contradiction, and practical principles like good is to be pursued and evil avoided. At the same time, the phenomenologists are right to observe that what is given gives itself from itself, with content that exceeds the understood content of our concepts and principles. When I set aside attention to the properties of being, when I turn off the act of conceptualization and just attend to what shows up, the sheer event of unconditioned givenness appears to me. Experientially, I think I have good reason to hold to both Thomistic and phenomenological principles. So much for the material approach to dialogue. A second approach to dialogue between schools of thought is to consider them formally, with respect to their methods. In the phenomenological reduction, we set out of attention what is not given, like causal explanations, assumed presuppositions, merely posited properties, even real existence, inasmuch as it is posited rather than directly experienced. When we do this in order to attend to what is given, this, I think, can be understood as an ascetic practice in which we discipline ourselves to not perform acts like positing or assuming. And it's also a practice of perception training, in which we learn to deliberately perform and focus on acts of reflective attention. Different versions of the phenomenological method are grounded in different accounts of what should be bracketed in order to arrive at what is fundamental. Realist phenomenologists like Dietrich von Hildebrand bracketed assumed principles and causal explanations. Husserl bracketed those things and posited extramental existence to focus on intentional acts and objects. Heidegger bracketed the given's status as intentional object in order to focus on given being. Marion bracketed considerations of being in order to focus on pure givenness, and so on and so forth. In the Thomistic method, by contrast, broadly considered, we begin with sensory experiences and then abstract from them or render their content intelligible, expressing that intelligibility in concepts, principles, and arguments. We thereby grasp what belongs to all members of a kind, or to the very being or essence of things, not just their appearance. We also receive intelligible principles from teaching by other human persons or by God. The act of understanding principles, intellectus, grasps the truth about whole beings. It unifiedly grasps a multiplicity of things. But to understand the content of this unity, we must unpack it by reasoning, ratio, reasoning out what follows from principles. From this reasoning, ideally at least, we attain again a simple understanding, intellectus, informed by scientific reasoning, so that we understand in an articulate and fully conscious way, and in relation to the highest causes and the most fundamental properties of being. Now, dialogue between two schools based on formal method will begin by considering each method purely in terms of how it technically works, apart from content-laden claims that justify it. And I think we see an example of this kind of attempt at dialogue in the work of Edith Stein. Stein brings Thomism and Phenomenology into dialogue by considering how their formal methods, considered in themselves, can intersect. Phenomenology uses what she calls the Augustinian way. We start with the life of the conscious I and examine its acts and objects. Thomism uses the Aristotelian way. We start with what imposes itself on our senses and then reason from sensory experience to the structure of both sensed objects and of the sensing subject. Stein contends that when one follows these methods without initially presupposing content from either school, one will arrive at the same basic structures and principles. The two methods converge. Both of them reveal to us structures like act and potency, form and matter, the transcendentals, the four causes. All of these things, she thinks, are found in both sensed beings and in the interior flow of conscious life. Now, this might seem at first like a more promising route towards dialogue than the first material causal way. This route to dialogue seems to sidestep the conflict over principles at the beginning of dialogue, since it begins with what stands behind that content, the methods whereby one arrives at principles and other content in the first place. Still, I do not think that this approach will ultimately be more successful than the first. And that's because I don't think formal method can be fully grasped apart from material content and principles. Thomists have reason to think that their abstractive method works because it's bound up with and fits with their principles about what the human person and the human intellect are in their being, and about how they link up with reality, being itself. Likewise, phenomenologists have reason to think that their method works because it's concomitant with claims about what the conscious subject is, how the conscious subject connects with what is other than itself. Each school has no more reason to accept the other's methods than it does to accept the other's claims and principles. If there's going to be dialogue between these schools, and if their methods and content are going to aid one another, as I think they can, then there must be something already common to them that is not dependent on their formal methods or their material content. And this common principle, I contend, is final causal, a shared end, not in the sense that Father Philip Neri was talking about it yesterday in terms of shared topics, but in the sense of a activity that both schools aim at performing. And I would contend, though they might not all use these words, that for both Thomists and phenomenologists, the goal of philosophy, theology, or other intellectual activity is contemplation. Contemplation is the loving, enjoyable beholding of what is fundamentally meaningful, what fits with and satisfies our minds and hearts. To contemplate is to see the truth by direct perception or intuition and respond to it with love and enjoyment inasmuch as it is good or valuable in itself. Now, I want to first consider how Thomism and phenomenology each aim at this end, and then I want to show how thinking about these schools in light of this shared end enables dialogue and synthesis between them. Now, on St. Thomas's view, we intellectual beings, we persons, can grasp essences and beings as such. And we know ourselves by reflecting on our acts of grasping beings. And we're thereby simultaneously led to desire to know our own cause and the cause of being. But we don't just want to know about these causes, to grasp them by signs, concepts, propositions, or syllogisms. Rather, we want to perceive those causes directly. Knowing that certain things are true about being and reasoning about beings is teleologically ordered toward direct vision or understanding, intellectus, of the highest causes. Wisdom, the highest intellectual virtue, inclines us to contemplative acts of attaining, touching, even tasting what is highest and most meaningful, what most fits with and perfects our minds and wills. Contemplation is both an act of theoretical understanding or seeing and a practical or responsive act of love, enjoyment, and resting in what is seen. We contemplate in different ways through different sciences and different acts. Through natural efforts, we begin contemplation with what St. Thomas, following Richard of St. Victor, calls cogitatio, perceiving many effects by sensing and imagining, from which one gathers unified, simple truths. Thomistic claims and methods invite us to contemplate even mundane sensory objects, to let our minds and wills lovingly adhere to them and rest in them, but not for their own sake, but for the sake of thereby grasping higher and more unifying truths. On this basis, in philosophy, which we again do by our own natural efforts, we perform acts of speculatio, wherein we perceive the highest causes as reflected in their naturally observable effects. In these acts, we don't just know that certain claims are true of what is highest, but rather what is highest is, in a sense, given to us. In reasoning philosophically about the properties of being, or about God as first cause, I have a mediated vision of these things through my reasoning. I see with my mind how the properties of being are present in all things. Or I grasp, through the mediation of perceiving and reasoning about the motion of sensory things, how there is an unmoved mover acting in all motion. Yet although speculatio is contemplation of what is highest, it is ordered to a yet higher act, contemplatio properly speaking, in which we directly perceive, enjoy, and admire what is highest. This occurs in different ways through natural reasoning and insight, or supernaturally through theology, faith, the gift of wisdom, and the beatific vision. The point of intellectual inquiry, by whatever method, is to come to the happy vision of what is most fundamental. An intellectual method is successful, and a principle or concept is worth adopting inasmuch as it effectively directs us towards contemplation of what is highest. Now, I think that phenomenology also sees that intellectual life aims at contemplation. For Husserl, and here I'm drawing on the crisis of European sciences, phenomenology's purpose is to overcome the spiritual crisis about meaning into which pure reliance on the positive sciences has plunged us. Positive science here means any intellectual approach which directs our attention away from what is given towards abstract principles. For example, the natural sciences at times direct attention away from what is observed to theoretically posited explanatory causes, like fields of force or evolutionary speciation events, which are never directly given. Never directly have these things presented to us. At least to some extent, positive sciences preclude the intimacy with reality that is contemplation. Phenomenology brings us to reflective clarity about the things themselves, things insofar as they directly fit with our acts and are thereby meaningful for us. It is a technique for attaining a sense for the meaningfulness of life. By bracketing what does not appear and considering what does, we rediscover the close bonds between the world and each one of us. We are enabled to contemplate everything given in itself, and not just for the sake of contemplating something further, like unifying truths or explanatory causes. Different phenomenological reductions set before our attention different given phenomena, different ways that we are meaningfully united with the world, and different experiences of ourselves, for example, as a pure subject, or as a subject related to other subjects, or as one who receives myself as a gift. But all the phenomenological reductions aim at direct awareness of the meaningful bond among these things. In short, at contemplation. Now, phenomenological reductions, I think, are theoretical methods, but they are also practical responses to what is worthwhile. Martin Heidegger describes the most meaningful phenomenological act as one where I do not impose any concepts or principles on being or on anything given, nor try to analyze it or subordinate it to my ends or my conceptual system, but I simply thankfully let beings be. Realizing this so that the being can show itself to me in its fullness, and I watchfully wait for its self-revelation. Dietrich von Hildebrand similarly describes how the aim of all knowing in general, and of the phenomenological method in particular, is a loving and enjoying beholding of reality, an intimate union of the mind and affections with reality at its most fundamental. reality insofar as it is valuable or important in itself. We should directly contemplate not just the ultimate causes of things, but all valuable things, persons, artworks, the natural world, moral acts, values like beauty and moral goodness, and being as such. Contemplation here involves not just intellectually perceiving what is valuable, but being moved by it effectively and making a due response to it. Attaining that state, again, requires ascetic effort, not just mentally setting aside what is not given, but disciplining myself by recollecting my attention from what distracts me. And even, as Arazin Kohak argues in his account of phenomenological reduction, divesting myself of material possessions that prevent me from attending to what is given. Or, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty notes, learning to attend to my own body and its meaningful self-sensing and intertwining with the world. If we begin a dialogue between Thomism and phenomenology, not with commitment to particular claims or formal methods, but to achieving contemplation as the end of intellectual life, then the content and methods of each school will be grasped primarily as means to that end, having value just insofar as they help us attain that end. This relieves us, I think, of the need to always defend the principles or thinkers of either school. We will be willing to revise and correct them if that would be a more effective means to direct contemplation of reality as such. Since, on this approach, methods only have value as means to contemplation, we will be willing to supplement these methods with one another and with other methods to achieve a more direct, complete contemplation of reality. We are always already in contemplative contact with the world. That contact just needs to be refined and disciplined. And we can tell when it's successfully refined inasmuch as we directly experience a closer fit with the given, with reality. From this standpoint, phenomenological methods can supplement Thomism in a few ways. And some of this reiterates what others have said, especially what Daniel said yesterday in his talk. Thomistic abstraction and reasoning relies on successful cogitatio, the consideration of many given phenomena, so as to grasp principles on their basis. That grasp of principles, reasoning about them, and any contemplation that results will be more successful the more one has contemplated the initial givens. The phenomenological method is a focused, rigorous means for clearly seeing what is given. By using phenomenological method as a means to contemplatively collect meaningful evidence for objective principles, those methods can aid Thomistic ones. Thomists can use phenomenological data as starting points for metaphysical and causal reasoning, asking what reality is like such that it is given as phenomenologists describe. We will more perfectly philosophically contemplate the highest causes as they are reflected in observable effects, the better we grasp those effects as they are meaningfully given. Phenomenology shows us how to attend rigorously to phenomena as such, insofar as they are given prior to the grasp of objective principles, including what is given in pure sensory or affective experience, prior to conceptualization and propositional expression. As Max Scheler saw, phenomenological methods give the mental discipline to deactivating the conceptualizing tendency of the human mind, while still activating its powers of attention and memory, which allows us to attend to those givens. Likewise, as we saw from Marion, there are phenomena that do not appear to us if we think of them as subsumed under principles, even very general principles like the law of non-contradiction. Indeed, this is implicitly true for the Thomist as well, for whom being as such is given prior to any consideration of the law of non-contradiction. The phenomenological method allows us to directly contemplate that initial impact of being, or the given, that experience of the self-manifestation of being prior to the formulation of principles. This yields, I think, a greater sense of the intrinsic meaningfulness of all givens, which are worth contemplating in themselves, not only as a basis for speculatio and contemplatio of the highest causes. Phenomenological method helps us see that meaningfulness itself is present even in mundane phenomena, like daydreams, fictional objects, everyday artifacts. Not only can we say that these phenomena point to the highest cause, God, who is meaningfulness as such, but that meaningfulness as such, and so God, is directly given in them. If the end of intellectual life is contemplation of what is fundamental, this is, to some extent, fulfilled in contemplating anything, inasmuch as we find there meaningfulness, being, and the presence of God. Likewise, Thomistic method supplements what is lacking in phenomenological method. Phenomenologists can use Thomistic principles to guide them to fundamental experiences of the given. There are rich experiences underlying Thomistic metaphysical and theological claims, which phenomenologists can extract, but which they might not discover unless they were guided by more universal principles, like those given by Thomism. Furthermore, much of the given presents itself not only as intrinsically meaningful and worth contemplating, but as incomplete, as not fully meaningful, not fully explaining itself, not fully contemplatable. As several have alluded to, we see this in the simplest experiences. Like when we grasp that when we're looking at one side of a three-dimensional object like a table, we only see that side of it, though we apperceptively grasp that it has other sides. And we're given the possibility of moving around it and taking up potentially infinitely many perspectives upon it. The table appears as constituted in and beyond these many perspectives, but is never completely given in full. It never appears fully meaningful because it never fully fits together with me and my acts. The table also resists my efforts to fully grasp it. It appears as something real, a center of forces distinct from me. It calls me to ask how and why it exists apart from me. Phenomenological method moves me towards causal reasoning, but phenomenological method requires setting out of attention causes that are not given. Thomistic method then picks up where phenomenological method leaves off, since Thomistic method enables me to draw more universal principles out of what is given, reason to causes, and thereby grasp the full being of what is given and the causes of that being. Now, I think both of these schools of thought invite us to contemplate things as perfectly and holistically as possible. It's something they both want. We could say that each school can criticize the other for not being realist enough, not attending well enough to the things themselves. Given that both methods enable us to attend to things themselves, there is good reason to adopt at least some of the principles and methods of each school. But there's also reason to see both methods as incomplete, needing to be supplemented by each other and by approaches beyond them. Both methods involve setting out of attention some features of reality in order to attend to others. Thomistic reasoning always involves abstraction, drawing out the essence of a being, or separating out a feature of the being as being, but setting aside or moving past attention to appearances as such. Phenomenological method involves setting out of attention aspects of givens that do not directly appear, in order to focus on those that do. This partiality in each school is present even though each school aims at a holistic total experience of things. Thomism aims at contemplation of God and of all things in relation to Him, at contemplation of all things as having the act of existence, the act that is the fundamental actuality of whatever is. We see this aim, for example, in the increasing attention to beauty in many strands of recent Thomism. For example, Jacques Maritain's description of beauty as the splendor of all the transcendentals together. This is an approach to being that's holistic, intuitive, grasp all the transcendentals at once in a single experience. Phenomenology aims at total contemplative union with the given, at letting things fully be or give themselves. Many of its strands also have attended significantly to beauty, often understood as the total value or the irreducible fullness of things. But while each method has these aims, seeking the goal of grasping things in their wholeness, or in my terms, in their beauty, neither can fully deliver on this goal, since each one proceeds by setting aside some aspects of what's given and focusing on others. No method that is basically analytic and partial can entirely achieve the synthetic, holistic, intuitive vision of the whole that is needed for the fully contemplative life. Now, one way to solve this problem, I think, is to see both Thomistic method and phenomenological method as parts of a more holistic and intrinsically contemplative method. And elsewhere, like in my book on the human person, building on Hans von Balthasar, I've called this method the aesthetic method. This is the standpoint of holistic experience that I mentioned earlier. It is a method of attending to phenomena, beings or other givens, as self-manifesting wholes, irreducible to what is directly given in them or to what is grasped about them in abstract causal or metaphysical reasoning. To consider something as a contemplatable, self-manifesting whole just is to consider it as beautiful. The aesthetic method approaches anything as beautiful in this sense. In this method, our attention and response to a thing is entirely guided by the beautiful phenomenon itself. One lets the phenomenon show itself in every way that it shows itself, and then one articulates how the phenomenon shows itself. One maintains a constant openness to letting it show itself in ever new ways, and one thereby discovers different approaches to it, always checking those methods against the way the whole reveals itself, and letting oneself see the whole anew guided by these approaches. The methods and principles of Thomism and phenomenology are then taken as articulating different perspectives on the one beautiful phenomenon. Thomistic method articulates beautiful, holistically self-manifesting phenomena insofar as they give themselves to abstractive and causal reasoning. Phenomenological method articulates beautiful phenomena insofar as they directly give themselves when we set aside abstractive and causal reasoning. By seeing the principles of each school as an articulation of some, but not all, aspects of beauty, we can see how those principles fit together, without thinking of either set of principles as articulating the whole beautiful phenomenon. This aesthetic method is a method of contemplation. We lovingly behold and enjoy a beautiful phenomenon in its wholeness for its own sake, letting it guide our approach to it and our articulation of its content, letting it lead us to freely respond to the call of its value, including by actively safeguarding it, by further lovingly contemplating it, by seeking to imitate it, by becoming beautiful oneself, and by making more beauty in the world. We unpack its content through analytic methods like the Thomistic and phenomenological methods, but only to more completely contemplate and respond to it. For the intellectual inquirer who aims ultimately at perfect contemplation of things in themselves, only a method that is intrinsically holistic, attentive to things as wholes, will be adequate. Every partial or analytic method will be to some extent inadequate to this task. But every partial method, with its claims and principles, will be adoptable by the one using the aesthetic method, insofar as, from the perspective of the whole, one can see how the claims and methods of each school capture some aspect of the whole. To contemplate the beautiful whole of things is our privilege as persons who can know and love. St. Thomas, Husserl, and their followers give us ways to live out that privilege, for which we should be truly grateful.